Now, this mind map is about free and open source software. And again, you'd see the standard thick lines, more prominent topics, the works, and not much to say about this again. Couple of pictures here and there, couple of different colors, and you might have noticed I've drawn both mind maps by actually combining two boards together. And generally, at the end of this class, people took a lot of pictures, and that helped them remember all of the topics that we discussed. So, just a very, very quick overview would tell you that what we discussed in the session was what's open source software, what are the roles in an open source software project, what are the different kinds of licenses, why is ThoughtWorks interested in open source software, what are our thoughts about open source software itself, what happens when you work on open source software and what are the issues involved, what are the best practices when you do so, and when on a project, what are the things to consider. So as you can see, it gives a very, very visual and a single snapshot picture of what was discussed in class. Cool. So now we'll move back to our good old mind map that we've been building, and we'll talk about a few things that you need to remember before you do mind maps in class. Okay, so here are a couple of things you'd like to remember and keep in mind before you actually start using mind maps in a classroom. One of the things that I often talk about is that a mind map should never be used without explanation. So I'll write that down. Mind maps should always be explained. I'll actually take this back and connect it to something I said earlier, which is that if you've got a mind map that you've created in advance, what it represents is a map of your mind. It doesn't necessarily represent what the other people understand. So if you would actually take this very mind map and just hand it out to someone else, that person would find it really difficult to understand what I told you in the session. On the other hand, if you were to describe each and every branch and help them understand what you meant and what went on in this class, or this is not a class, this is a video presentation, so what went on in the video presentation, they'd perhaps understand a lot better. So remember, mind map should always be accompanied with explanations. Remember, mind maps are all about group learning. So it's perhaps ideal that you draw the mind map simultaneously with your presentation. A couple of other things to remember with mind maps, and I'll go through them really quickly. One happens to be order. Now, while mind maps actually represent gradient thinking, there's no reason why they can't represent chronology. For example, we've gone through 4 main topics right now. We first went through what a mind map is. We went through what are the principles of drawing mind maps and using them. We talked about why you would like to use mind maps, and now we're talking about things to remember before you start to draw them. So there's a definite chronology which has been represented by a clockwise ordering. You could also use numerical ordering if you wanted to. I prefer using clockwise ordering because it's implicit and it doesn't bind you to too many rules. It's just one thing that you need to remember as convention. A couple of other things. You've seen the mind maps that I showed you. They tend to get really large, so get yourself a large space. A good tip is to join 2 whiteboards. That'll give you enough space and you can just start drawing from the center. The last thing I'd like to say, and it's definitely not the least important, it's perhaps the most important, and that's about clarity. Some of us have difficulty writing on the whiteboard. If you're one of those people, make sure that you write in uppercase. You print all your letters on the mind map. So the tip is print. Make sure that there's clarity in your text as well as any pictures that you're using. Remember, if people can understand them, they'll use them. But if they can't understand what you're writing, your entire effort is, I wouldn't say useless, but not very useful. So, those are a few things to remember. Now, while we're talking about mind maps being used in a classroom, often you'd be able to use mind maps to structure your lessons. You would have seen Confluence and you would have seen a lot of session plans that run into pages. And often it's difficult to run through all of those pages and pass through them while you're in a session. I've often found that while preparing for a session, if I can draw a mind map to represent how the session goes, it helps me stay focused on the material that I need to deliver, as well as the students. So this is how I represent a session plan for myself once I've read through the main session plan in Confluence. So as you can see, it's got 4 branches, and those are the 4 sections to this 1.5 hour session. There's a recap where we talk about the homework. We then get into an activity where we divide people into different teams, announce a scenario, and then do a divisional meeting. We then do a debrief and of the activity, and then finally we move on to a closure where we talk about things that they'd like to improve in the future and the tools that they liked. So you can see I've gone ahead and marked some timings out here. So again, the clockwise ordering helps you understand in which direction this is flowing. I've gone ahead and put start and end timings. There are some symbols up here, you know, the smileys, the frownies, the question mark. There are some pictures. I've picked some clip art from the tool and just put it into the session plan. It becomes interesting for me to see, and I can very clearly see what are the different demarcations I've made. So this is a way you could use mind maps to prepare for sessions as against delivering sessions. Just remember that the only thing to keep in mind with this is that you shouldn't be drawing the same mind map that you have on your piece of paper on the board. What you're drawing on the board is something that the group agrees on, so it needs to have the same language that the groups come to a common consensus with. So I'll actually now end this presentation with a few other things that you'd like to keep in mind. So just switch back to our original mind map. Things that are important, and I'll put them in the also important section of this mind map. I'd like to also remind you that wherever you find this video presentation, you will also be able to find a JPEG of this mind map itself, so you wouldn't have to search too much to get this mind map if you've got this screencast. So in the also important section, I'd like to mention a couple of things. One is it's important to use imagery, but you don't need to be extremely artistic to use imagery in your mind maps. You could use stick figures in class, and they just do fine. A few symbols here and there should just do fine. As long as you can create color, that will resonate with your audience quite well. I'd like to ask you to avoid monotones. Now, the reason I say that monotones should be avoided is because monotones are boring, and generally if it's boring, people won't like to look at it, and it's like watching a black and white movie. So you'd like to be able to have a connection with your mind map as you'd like for your audience to as well. So try to avoid monotones, and I'm actually going to link this back with one of the other topics that we discussed earlier, which is using colors